Well, welcome to our presentation today. You're at the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPPEC. CIPPEC is delighted to host this discussion about the future of work during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. For those of you who don't know us, CIPPEC is one of 4 core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy and an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We were founded in 1983 on the principle that economic freedom and political freedom are linked. Today, our work is every bit as vital as it was back then.
¿Qué es this?
This topic, the future of work, is of great interest to CIPPEC as we chart new paths of entire organizations working remotely. We ourselves are just figuring this out and how this is going to work in the United States. In Latin America, these challenges take on new dimensions, factoring in complicated issues like big numbers of people working informally in the economy and governments that can't afford the huge economic relief packages being offered in Europe and North America. It appears that the impact of COVID-19 is going to have long-term impact on the way we work, even after the pandemic winds down. What will work look like then? And how will it evolve in the coming months and years? We're excited to hear from some of the most forward-looking think tanks in Latin America today on this topic, and ones I'm proud to say have been CIPPEC partners over the years.
Why don't we go on to our, we'll go on to our first speaker, Edna Jaime from Mexico, Evalúa in Mexico. I'll pass the microphone to Edna. Let me just let you know that what we'll be doing is each of our speakers will be having about 10 or 15-minute presentation where they will give us their ideas. And then later we'll have a question and answer, which I will moderate. My name is Centro. I'm the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at CIPPEC. To ask questions later on, we will ask you to use the chat box. You will see the group chat box. I will send a message there so you know where to put your messages. And we will take questions from that chat box for any of our presenters. So without any further news, I will pass the microphone on to Edna, who is the Executive Director of Mexico Evalúa. Edna?
Thank you very much for this invitation to talk about the future of work from the perspective of Mexico Evalúa. Thank you, John. Thank you, Andrew, for this invitation. Mexico Evalúa is a Mexico City-based public policy think tank. Our job is to build bridges between academic knowledge and government policy and decision making. We want to help society to better understand what is the government doing in the different arenas we are working on. We have 4 main areas of work. The first one is public safety and justice, budget transparency and accountability, anti-corruption policies, deregulation and competitive markets. It is our aim to inform citizens about policy arenas that need more accountability and better results. When I received this invitation, I have a hard time thinking about what the future will bring. I am sure we all feel the same these days. Thinking about the future has become much more difficult. The perception of time has changed for all of us since the lockdown began. These days, the word tomorrow has become the same as saying the short run. 6 months, it is the new long run. 1 year from now has become the distant future. New scenarios about the future fill our screens every day. It does not look good in terms of human, economic, and social cost of the pandemic. So if we are going to try and make an educated guess about the future of work in Latin America, and in particular, the future of work in Mexico, we have to start with a very stark prognosis. Bank of America estimates that 1.2 million formal sector jobs will be lost in Mexico by the end of 2020 as a consequence of an estimated drop of 8% in GDP. Recent figures by the National Statistical Authority, el INEGI, show that 2 million people were unemployed from January to March. This means that before the crisis hit, we were already bleeding jobs. The same source estimates that 4.5 million people were already working in informal jobs before the virus hit, which are usually poorly paid and lack social security schemes. A recent poll says that 77 of small and medium-sized enterprises are at risk of permanently closing down. Small and medium businesses account for 7 out of every 10 jobs in Mexico, which gives you an idea of how serious this crisis is. So for most Mexicans, the future of work in 2020 and 2021 will be very hard. The name of the game will be to hold down their jobs. For those unemployed, competition in the labor market will be fierce. They will have to acquire new skills or accept lower wages. Others will inevitably fall into the informal economy. Migration usually has been an escape valve in times of crisis in Mexico. Now it will also face new obstacles. The crisis is also affecting the labor market in the US, and immigration policies will become tougher than ever. Organized crime can become an alternative to many, especially younger Mexicans. We have to think about social, economic, and political consequences of such a challenging context. What is the role of government in providing a basic safety net for our people? What are the best policy responses in terms of the economic, social, policy, security, and the rule of law? How can the government make the most out of every peso it spends? Is this an opportunity to improve policy making, or an opportunity for corruption, political graft, and abuse? Those are the kind of questions that we are asking ourselves at Mexico Evalúa. And we are trying to make our best contribution to make the current circumstances the less painful they can be. Let me give you 3 very specific examples of what we are doing during the pandemic to accomplish our mission. First, we work to improve public safety. We conduct research to improve local police forces' performance using data science and geospatial analysis to pinpoint hotspots of crime. During the lockdown, we identified a new problem. Domestic violence is on the rise. Mexico is Latin America's second most dangerous country for women, after Brazil, according to the United Nations. And for countless women, being locked down at homes does not mean being safe, as their aggressors are often living under the same roof. President López Obrador stirred controversy as he has claimed that 9 out of 10 domestic violence reports to 9/11 are fake. What did we do? Go to the data and find out what is really going on. In February, 2020, the daily average of domestic abuse calls to 911 increased 110% compared to February 2019. In March, the annual increase was 191. In April, the increase was 210%. We identify the neighborhoods where these calls came from, and we systematize the victims and the aggressor profiles. The average age of victims is 40 years, 44% have a job, 34% are stay-at-home moms, 66% of the aggressors were the women's partners or husbands, 9% of aggressors were stepsons or stepdaughters. We are working to design new policies to help authorities fight against this behavior, as we know that femicide often begins with domestic abuse. A second example of our work, we are evaluating local government economic responses to the pandemic. Municipal and state level authorities are the first line of defense for families and businesses affected by the economic consequences of the lockdown. Unfortunately and understandably, as local authorities have rushed to implement different measures to avoid the collapse of their economies, this information has become difficult to grasp for the general public. By identifying and mapping the policy responses at the local level, we are trying to provide a service to the public. We create an online form for local officials to fill out with the general information about their economic relief programs. With this information, we also want to make a statement. Not all of the responses have to come from the federal government. In fact, the absence of a federal government response is motivating local initiatives with a very interesting governance scheme where non-governmental actors are participating. Finally, a third example is our work to support digital justice. As you know, the judiciary has also been affected by the lockdown since mid-March. All legal procedures have been put on hold, but some institutions at the state level have shown great capacity to adapt and implement online services. We are analyzing the best practices and establishing guidelines to ensure that the courts can provide online legal services while maintaining high professional standards. With these examples, I want to make the point that we are adapting our activities to generate evidence and analysis to promote conversation that can translate in good policy decisions. In a phrase, we have adapted our research to provide answers to the situation we are living in. In this time, ideas and knowledge are more important than ever. In recent years, some politicians around the world have told people that they have enough of experts. Others have said that anything that contradicts their agenda is fake news or a hoax. In Mexico, we have heard something along the idea that ruling a country is not rocket science. Think tanks became an unwelcome guest in policy debate. But I think that the pandemic has changed this radically. Since science, expertise, and evidence-based governance are again at the center of public decision-making. Those governments that rely on expertise and capabilities will have better chances to overcome the economic and social challenges of our days. The ability to design and implement evidence-based policies will be more important than ever in a context of scarcity and economic crisis. The future of work for think tanks looks full of challenges and opportunities. In the new normal, urgency is the name of the game. We have to provide policy solutions here and now. In the new normal, we have to act locally with global mentality, as we will need to focus on strengthening local institutions. In the new normal, we have to become better communicators and translate expert language into clear messages accessible to everyone. This is how Mexico Evalúa is imagining its role in the post-COVID world. This is the future of our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edna. That was very interesting and a great start to our discussion today. So next I would like to pass the microphone to Luis Fernando Mejía, who is the Executive Director of Fedesarrollo, a leading think tank in Colombia. Luis Fernando, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'm very grateful for the invitation. Thank you for CIPPEC for organizing this conference, and say hello to all the participants and of course to my fellow panelists. So I'd like to make three main points during this short talk about the future of work, which is hard to think about given the so many wide changes that we are currently suffering across Latin America and the world. First, I would like to talk a little bit about the impact that the crisis has been having in terms of growth, in terms of employment, and of course in terms of poverty levels. Second, I will talk a little bit about the impact that this crisis has been having in terms of measuring unemployment, which is not trivial, and I would like to make a point on that. And finally, I would like to think about what I think it's the main challenge for the region, for Colombia and the region as well, which is reducing informality levels. As long as we cannot have these high informality levels looking forward, because otherwise we won't be able to do all the necessary changes for thinking about the future of work. So let me start with scenarios for growth, unemployment, and poverty. So as Edna was saying for Mexico, for Colombia, we are also thinking about a contraction of economic growth that's going to be between 5 to probably 8%. Probably one of the economies in the region that's going to have faster growth, but still, I mean, a 5% contraction is something that we have not seen in Colombia for at least a century. So of course, that's going to have a very important impact in terms of both unemployment and of course, in terms of poverty levels. So first, the lockdown measures that have been, of course, necessary and have prevented a much faster spread of the coronavirus have also imposed very important economic costs. Our measures from Fedesarrollo are that 1 month of lockdown actually contracts economic activity in annual terms between 4.5 to 6%. So that's a huge impact in terms of economic activity, especially in economies like ours in the region, which suffer from, again, high informality levels, because these lockdown costs are actually disproportionately borne by those that are more informal and are below poverty levels. Now, in terms of unemployment rates, so Colombia has had a very structurally high unemployment rate for the past probably 10 or 15 years. Last year, even though we were coming from an acceleration period in terms of economic growth, last year we had unemployment rate on average of 10.5%, so double digits unemployment rates. Again, high structural unemployment rates in Colombia, where we have some issues that I'm going to discuss a little bit later. But still, we were reducing unemployment rates relative to what we had at the beginning of the decade. And these different scenarios between 5% and almost 8% of contraction in economic activity implies, of course, that unemployment levels are going to be higher. We estimate unemployment is going to be between 18 and 20%. So in the worst case scenario, we would actually see unemployment actually double in 2020. And that, of course, is going to have an impact in terms of poverty levels. Poverty rates at Colombia stood around 27% of total population. If you have unemployment going up in such large numbers, going to 18 or 20%, of course, that's going to have a negative impact in terms of household income, and that will increase poverty. And we expect that from the 27% that we currently have, poverty levels will go up to 34%. So that's going to have, again, a negative impact, not only in terms of unemployment, but also in terms of poverty levels. So that's kind of the scenarios that we're looking forward that, of course, are not good. And policies are going to be useful in terms of mitigating the negative impact in terms of unemployment, in terms of poverty, but also in speeding up the recovery rates for the near term. The second point I would like to make is about the issues about measuring unemployment when you have lockdowns like the one we have in Colombia and in other many countries in the region. I know that Mexico has been, of course, imposing more strict lockdown measures around the country, Argentina as well, and we have many examples around the region. So in March, where we have the latest figures for unemployment rates in Colombia, that were published about 2 or 3 weeks ago, Colombia suffered for employment losses of about 1.6 million persons. 1.6, that's about 7% negative growth, which is the largest fall in employment levels that we have seen for the past 20 years. So it's a huge impact in March. Just a reminder, lockdown measures were actually taken in the final days of March. If I remember correctly, it was 26 or 25, so the last days of March. But even though the lockdown measures were on the last few days, we have a huge negative impact in terms of unemployment for that month. Now, when you take a look at the unemployment numbers, despite having 1.6 million losses in terms of employment, unemployment only increased in about 300,000 persons. So there's a huge difference between the employment losses and the increase in unemployment. And why is this? Again, this goes to the point that it's hard to measure unemployment when you have lockdown, because by definition, if you're not allowed to go out of your home to look for employment opportunities, then you're not unemployed. But this is kind of a forced outcome where you're not allowed to look for employment, so the unemployment levels don't actually reflect what's going on the market. So that's an issue that we have to take into account in this type of analysis. As long as we have lockdowns, unemployment levels are going to be artificially low. So that's an issue. So it's better to look at employment growth, which, as I said again, in March, fell by about 7%, the largest losses that we have had for 20 years. So again, huge employment losses. April, where we have the full lockdown in the Colombian economy, is of course going to be much worse. We expect unemployment to reach probably 18 to 20% when you correct for these issues that I just mentioned. Now, the third point I would like to make is about informality. One of the main reasons why lockdown in emerging economies like Colombia and most of the region are having probably and are going to have a much higher impact in terms of especially people that are near the poverty line or a little bit above, those that we call the vulnerable population, is that we have very high informality rates. In the region, in Latin America as a whole, it's estimated to be about 50% of total workers, the number of informal jobs. In Colombia, that number is about 60% of the total population. So informality, of course, is an issue because, I mean, it's a good thing for most people when you're in an economic boom. You're away from being taxed by the government. Everything you earn, it's for you, and so on and so forth. But in bad times, informality makes you invisible for the government, and that prevents a more efficient way of transferring social subsidies and wage subsidies during this type of crisis. So the informality issue, it's a real problem. It reduces productivity growth, it reduces economic growth, but also it makes those populations more vulnerable to these types of shocks. And the informality levels in the region are just too high. I mean, having 50% of informality levels, this crisis is making clear that we do have to make an effort to solve these issues. Now, why informality levels are high? Well, one of the reasons is that most of the region has very high cost for hiring someone formally. So the relative cost of hiring someone formally versus doing it informally is very high. And the benefits sometimes are not that high. For example, in Colombia, every informal worker has access and full access to all the health services. What it prevents them from having access to is actually from the pension system, which is, of course, a huge cost, but is actually delayed in the future. But health is there, so that the relative benefits are not that high when you're in an economic boom. Now, another issue for Colombia is the relatively high minimum wage. So the minimum wage in Colombia is about 70% of the average wage in the Colombian economy, and is one of the highest across the region and also across OECD economies. So when you have a very high minimum wage relative to the average wage, which could be low in especially highly developed cities like Bogotá, Medellin, the largest cities, but is actually much higher when you go to more backward regions in Colombia. Then of course the market response is going to be hiring someone informally, because you cannot, it's not feasible to pay all the formal cost. So when we talk about the future of work, which is the theme of this webinar, of course we have to think about technological change, the virtualization of much of the processes that we were currently doing before the shock in a non-virtualized way. But before going to this, I would say frontier questions, we have to solve the informality issue in Latin America. The informality, again, detracts from productivity growth, detracts from economic growth, and makes people more vulnerable to the economic shocks like the one we're suffering right now. So one of the issues that we have to deal with in Colombia specifically is about how to make the minimum wage less binding. And of course, politically, it's just impossible to reduce the minimum wage. But we can think about having, for example, a differentiated minimum wage across regions, which is more akin to the way that labor productivity is around the country. So we don't have the same labor productivity in Bogotá as in La Guajira, which is a very less developed region in Colombia. So we could think about having differentiated wages that also promote competition across the regions, and that will probably reduce the informality rates that we're seeing. The other point is, I mentioned this before, is about the cost of being formal. So the last labor reform that was done in Colombia was in 2012, that was about 8 years ago. And the labor reform, essentially what it did was reduced in a very important amount, 13 percentage points, the cost of hiring someone formally. Not surprisingly, even though there was a high debate about whether this was going to be just a transfer to the firms, to the owners of the firms, well, not surprisingly, reducing the cost of hiring someone formally increased formality rates after this reform. Is estimated to have increased in a permanent way the formality rates between 4 to 5 percentage points. Now, it was not a huge impact because the cost of hiring someone formally are relatively high, but this crisis, again, is showing us the weaknesses in terms of the structural problem that the region and Colombia have been having for many decades. So I think it's a very nice opportunity to, again, put all these structural issues on the table, thinking about the ways that reforms could solve some of those issues, like reducing informality, and of course thinking about having recognizing the new ways of work. We have many new technologies that are being in a kind of a shadow of regulation, because the labor market regulations in Colombia are from 25 years ago. So my final point is, again, that even though we have very negative numbers in terms of growth, in terms of unemployment, in terms of poverty levels, I think this crisis opens up a window of opportunity for, again, thinking about this huge structural problems that the Colombian and the Latin American economies have been having for many decades, especially those related to the labor market, and then building all this consensus and the political willingness to go ahead and do the reforms that we know that they have the impact, but they are sometimes politically costly to implement. So this crisis will open up this window of opportunity. Hopefully, we're going to be able to do so, and that will increase, of course, the welfare of most workers across the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis Fernando. We appreciate your comments. Our final speaker will be Ramiro Albrieu, who's a principal researcher at CIPPEC. Ramiro, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks for the invitation. I have a couple of slides, but there. So I think that first that we from Argentina, we are about to end a lost decade in terms of growth, right? Now, so from 2011 on, and so now we are, I don't know, thinking about maybe extending our lost decade for a 2 decade or something. So it's really dramatic, the situation, the macroeconomic situation in Argentina, because I mean, it's not only about structural problems such as informality, it's not only about the COVID-19, but also about the debt, huge debt problem that we are still trying to solve. So in a way, we have, if you want to make a list of macroeconomic problems, we will have it all now. So it's really complex, the situation. And so I'm going to give you some idea of how labor markets are being affected by COVID-19, and also trying to link these changes with the future of work literature or debates. But again, you need to understand that we are having also many unsolved problems. And so in a way, it's a kind of big bang of different shocks that are all coming together. So it's really, really complex. So having said that, well, sorry, can you, okay, you can stay there. So I think that globally, this COVID-19 situation is being forced us to enter into maybe, I don't know if it's the deepest, but for sure the most accelerated social and economic re-engineering process of all history. So I'm a little changing my view about COVID-19 as I'm seeing new data, new developments, but I think that is a huge challenge for every country. Now, if you go to Latin America, you need to add if you look at history, the lesson that we are not good at managing sudden changes in the external context. We always fail to adapt to these windows of opportunity or critical junctures or these type of sudden changes in context. So for Latin America as a whole, I think that it is complex because we have like a big shock of this COVID-19, but also our low ability to cope with shocks. So it's really a very complex situation in the region. So in CIPPEC, we are trying to generate data about what is going on with labor markets during this COVID-19 in order to inform policy, right? Because as Edna said before, we need to think again that data is important, right? So for informing policy, and we're trying to do that now. So we analyze labor markets in terms of these 4 topics that I have here. First, essentiality. Second, the potential of telework. Third, the physical proximity in the workplace. And finally, the physical proximity in public transportation or going to the workplace. So we're trying to get data about these topics and then trying to figure out the challenges in our labor markets. Next, please. So, and next, just to see the, so first, legally, 6 out of 10 workers in Argentina are not able to leave their houses. So it's a huge disruption to labor markets. Of course, as Fernando said, and Edna also, informality is high. In Argentina, it's about 35%. So we know that many of these workers that are not legally able to leave the house, they are anyway working, and this is particularly true in poor neighborhoods, in shanty towns, and so on. So, but again, this type of data, I mean, I never seen this type of shock to the Argentine labor market, even in the 2001 crisis. It was not that deep, the disruption. Next. So, okay, maybe one option is just to work from home. You can say, okay, you can stay at home and work from there. But we analyze our labor market, our 12 million people working in the big cities. And we found out that 3 out of 10 of these workers perform tasks that can be done at home. So 70% of the labor market need to go out. They need to agglomerate. They need to cooperate to work in close proximity to others. So this is, I believe, the main tension between the economic cost of lockdown and the health benefits of the lockdown. And also, you need to understand that this 29% is just a potential, right? It has to do with the task that you perform. But if you look at the data about the actual teleworkers, it's just 10%. So here, there's a huge gap between those who are actually teleworking and those who can or may telework with proper technology, with proper policies. Next. So then we move to analyze proximity in the workplace. So this little complex figure, but this shows the Argentine labor market in terms ordered by the proximity to others in the workplace. So as you can see, for example, public administration is low proximity because you can work just with your computer in one office. But then you have, on the right, you have teaching, restaurants, of course, social services, health services. I mean, these type of jobs has to do with agglomerations, to work together, to physical contacts. So we found that 5 out of 10 workers in Argentina perform tasks in close proximity to others. So this is a huge problem because when we think about a path to a new normal, we need to take into account that we will have to change the way these people work. We need to have to reassign tasks. We need to create new protocols, new regulations, because without the vaccine, we are not able just to return to the previous way of doing things. At least for this half of the right of the Argentine labor market. Next. Then, of course, it's not only an issue of agglomeration in the workplace, but also agglomeration going to the workplace or in public transport. This is a huge problem in big cities in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, in Rosario, and in Córdoba, because there, half of workers agglomerate in this public transportation system, right? And this have also had to do with some workers that maybe they work just without other workers in their workplace. I mean, with a low proximity in the workplace, but they have to take the subway or a bus or whatever, so they can find the virus here. So again, this is very complex, because if we are thinking about how can we create this new normal, we need to think not only about technology for telework, not only about new protocols inside firms for proximity in the workplace, but also we need to rethink the public transportation system. And all these issues are huge issues that we were trying to solve, to reform in the past, and we failed. As with the minimum wages and all the problems of the high cost of hiring. I mean, we know that we have problems there, but it's really hard to come up with solutions. And now we need to solve it in 6 months, in 3 months, or maybe in 1 month, just in order to make, to allow people to earn money again through the labor market. Next. So, next. Sorry, I have here. Next, you can, there. Okay. So, how I'm seeing all the story of the COVID-19 in Latin America through this timeline, right? First, we have this shock, maybe in early February or late February or early March. Then we have the impact that, of course, had to do with the shock itself, but also with all the government policies associated with the lockdown. And then we are now in this little tiny red, I believe it's red or pink point there, where we are creating the new normal, but we don't know. Maybe what we do now, in a way, will create maybe a good or a normal that new normal that will work for everybody or not. So I believe that we are in kind of this turning point or bifurcation in terms of different futures. And I believe that here is where the future of work agenda enters into the picture, because I believe that we need to insist on bringing long-run policies into the picture of short-run issues. I believe that, for example, the Argentine government has no fiscal space to just provide money for the next 6 months to those who have to remain at home. So we need to come up with innovation, with thinking about policies. And I believe that this idea of bringing long-run policies into the debate can make a difference now. So I believe, for example, that technology policy is maybe more important now than it used to be. Even with Fernando, for thinking about informality, because you can create some informality environments through technology. So I'm not sure that we need to postpone all these issues, but we need to bring this together to think about maybe extraordinary policies for extraordinary times, right? Next. So let me give you one example, because this is too general. Next, please. Next slide. There. I think that I see this shock. I believe that it represents what I think about this issue. That, for example, take digital transformation, right? It was this shock about this guy saying to the board, digital transformation is years away. I don't see this company having to change anytime soon. And suddenly it came the COVID-19, right? And so what was an issue of long-run productivity, with a 5 to 10 year horizon, now it becomes some urgent issue of survival. And not only for firms, not only for workers, but also maybe for an entire economy. So I think that we need to bring policy frameworks for fostering long-run growth. I think that they are key to design this path to a new normal. right? I believe that we need to sit in the same table, those who are working on social policy with people who are working on tech policy, because we need to work in all these different paths of creation of this new normal. Let me give you just 3 examples of 3 policies. Next. One is tech policy. I believe that we need to encourage firms to accelerate technological adoption. For example, when I was talking about telework, in Argentina, only 3% of firms are implementing some telework solutions, some technology for remote work. So we need to change that. For households, for example, 3 out of 5 households has a computer. So we need to change that. We are thinking about teaching, digital education, and working from home. Okay, we need to change. We need to accelerate technological adoption, not only in firms, but also in the houses, right, at home. Of course, governments. I mean, these governments are all the jobs in the government are low proximity jobs. So we can think of move to a more remote way of working in governments, but for that you need reform. So I believe that this is important. Second, skills. In the past, we used to focus on reskilling for young people, for young adults. But now we need to focus on maybe not digital natives, but maybe people from 35, 40, 45, because they have the ability to telework. They have the occupations that can be teleworkable, but in order to do that, you need to reskill them. So this is an important issue. I believe that we need to take this into consideration. And finally, regulation policy. And this has to do with what Luis Fernando was saying before. We need to innovate. I mean, we have, in Latin America, we have like a formal sector, formal labor market with a lot of regulation. It's very costly to enter into there. And then we have the flexible labor market. Without any regulation, it's really hard for the government to try to improve their well-being of these workers, because it's really hard to have information about them. So we need to start working on a middle ground, how we create, how we regulate more flexible labor markets, how we create a middle ground between the informals and the formal, like with all these old labor institutions that were fine during the 60s or 70s, but they are no longer fine for this labor market. So I believe that in these 3 axes, we need to work. This all has to do with long-run policy related to the future of work, but now I believe that there will be key in creating this path to a new normal for everybody. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ramiro. I'm fascinated by your term digital immigrant, and I'm hoping that we have a little more discussion about what that term means. So while everybody, we're going to open up soon for questions to our audience here. So while they are collecting their thoughts and providing their questions, I wanted to open it up to any of the other panelists who may have a question of each other before we turn things over to our audience for questions. Do any of you have questions of any of the other participants? Feel free to.
I have just one comment.
Okay.
If I'm allowed. Ramiro mentioned a little bit about its focus on technological innovation and the impending need for many firms and jobs to accommodate to this new reality that they're going to probably with us for the near future. I'm okay with that, and if I said that, if I send the wrong impression that I'm not focusing on that, that's not what I meant to say. Is that, of course, this crisis has taught us that there are a lot of things that are being able to be virtualized. It can be done in an virtual way, and especially in the relationship between the citizens and the governments. Typically, governments are very, risk averse in terms of incorporating technologies. But in this lockdown, the need for virtualizing most of the activities and the relationship between citizens and the government are there, and I think it's going to have a structural impact on the speed of appropriation of technologies in the region. My point is that's fine, but we cannot let the opportunity to be passed, which is the one about doing the structural reforms that the region needs, because we might be too comfortable about incorporating these activities, virtualizing most of the processes. But if we don't do the reforms, then we're going to left with still the 50% informality, and some of them with in a virtual way. But I mean, that's not a way in which we can solve these issues. We have to advance in both fronts at the same time. Thank you very much.
Edna, you look like you might have a question.
I have a comment and a question for my colleagues, and it has to do with political leadership. What we are seeing in Mexico is that, this pandemic, we were in a very bad shape before this pandemic hit. And I'm sure there are a lot of opportunities. And I think tanks, we have a very specific and important role in forming policy decisions. If we have, in the side of the government, politicians that can want to hear new ideas, but if we don't have that, how can you imagine we can have an impact in the public debate on how to adopt new ideas, new policies to cope and that can help us cope with the current situation, and that can look for the future of how can we transform our way of doing things to make them better and to help rebound from the crisis. I don't know what is the experience your experience in Argentina and Colombia, if you have better leaderships that are taking into account the good ideas that can put in place to help dealing with the crisis and the post-COVID era.
Okay. First, yes, Fernando, we are on the same track on this issue. I'm not a techno-optimist in the sense that we can solve everything, our deep problems with technology. I agree with you, but I also believe that maybe we can find a way of create this new regulatory environment, for, more flexible than formal, but trying to attract all the informality to some kind of formality. Maybe it could be electronic formality. That was what I'm saying about bringing technology into the debate about informality, but I'm not saying, again, I agree with you about our structural problems. So, but anyway, I'm not that sure that we can solve structural problems during a crisis. I'm not sure if we can manage this as an opportunity or not. And in a way, I'm connecting this issue with the issue of Edna about the leadership. In a way, if you are thinking that, if we think that a crisis can be an opportunity, but we need proper leadership in order to create this situation. Otherwise, maybe crisis is a good way to create new populist, politicians with disregard to data, to proper policies, and to knowledge. I mean, I'm not that sure that we will emerge from the COVID-19 with better leaders. I mean, maybe I'm more pessimistic about this. I'm trying to bring data to politicians saying, look, I have the data, but, but then I don't know if our political class, our politicians are up to the task. You know, I'm not sure about that.
Let me comment, if I may, a little bit about this exchange and about the Edna's question, which I think it's very important. So Ramiro, one of the things I think you're a little bit pessimistic is because you're from Argentina, right? So political leadership is actually very scarce in Argentina, and it has been so for many years. And that's why I think I'm very optimistic about Colombia. One of the issues about Colombia that probably some of you know is that Colombia is a remarkably stable economy. So in the past 100 years, we have had 3 years with negative growth, 2 in the Great Depression, 1929, 1930, and the Great Emerging Market Crisis in 1999. So it's a very remarkably stable economy, where I think that, and going back to Edna's question, the way in which think tanks can influence policy is much crystal clear, because leadership typically supports itself with technocracy, takes decisions based on evidence, and that's why I think I'm a little bit more optimistic than Ramiro. I think, and I agree with you completely. If you don't have the political leadership to implement the reforms, of course, this will be a missed opportunity. But if you have the political leadership, I think the history shows that crises are the periods where deep reforms are made, and these reforms are typically hard to come by or implement when you're in a boom, when you're in economic growth. So of course, I agree completely with you. You need both the political willingness and of course this dialogue between political leaders and the technocracy and think tanks to implement these reforms.
Thank you very much. Let me keep going on that question. Here in the United States, what we've seen in an interesting way is leadership on the state level coming to the surface, not just at the national level, and even down to like counties and cities. Leaders suddenly appearing and playing instrumental roles. Do you think that that kind of leadership could come out of your countries as well? Is that part of what can happen as a result of this? Or, for example, the private sector. What role does the private sector have, perhaps, in helping to shape some of the leadership role that you find lacking right now? Does anybody have any comments on that?
Yes, I have. In Mexico, the federal response has been so short and inappropriate that some governors are having their own responses. And we are looking and we are seeing a very interesting governance scheme to deal with the crisis that includes non-governmental actors. I'm looking at very interesting initiatives, for example, in Nuevo León, where the government is working with private sector, with civil society organizations, first to attend the health crisis, but also to implement economic measures to deal with the crisis. So I think it's a very good opportunity to cultivate new leaderships and finally to understand that public policy and politics is not only a federal issue, and that we are going to see, as we have started to see, very interesting local initiatives. I think it's very good news for the country because the federal government is really responding in a very incorrect way. So I hope we can see more of these mechanisms of participation where private sector, government, civil society are taking part of the solution in these difficult times. I really like very much these governance structures or governance schemes where different actors are involved in solving public problems.
Luis Fernando, please.
Yeah, so that goes back to our previous discussion about how to influence policy. So one of the things that might be useful in this current crisis is that if political leadership is absent at the national level, then you can work with local governments to influence policy, and that would solve a little bit the problem that we were discussing before. And I think that's a great opportunity to not only produce this new leadership, but also influence policy through local governments instead of national government, if the political willingness is not there. But one problem with that is that initial conditions matter a lot. So typically what we're going to see is that those more advanced local governments, meaning those that are coming from highly developed states, that have the institutional capacity, where the private sector is more integrated with local authorities, will probably deal better with the crisis. So that will open up again inequalities in terms not at the territorial level, which is something that we have to address because the institutional capacity is key for responding to these crises at the local level.
Yeah, let me add on that in Argentina, we are seeing something that is novel, totally new, that is a total coordination between different levels of government. That for me, is something new. I mean, for the last 2 decades, maybe. I mean, I just see, conflicts and tensions between different political parties, different levels of government. And in a way, now they are trying to work together. Of course, with these asymmetries that Fernando was saying, right? It's not the same a big city as Buenos Aires that has the capacity, they have their own research about the virus and all that, than a small city in Jujuy, I don't know, in the north. But I think that in Argentina, for the first time in many years, these different level of governments are all working together, and that's something good.
But I can see the risk that Luis Fernando just pointed out. Regional gaps can become bigger because some Mexican states, for example, have more capabilities, institutional capabilities, more civil society organizations, and they have much more resources. And if they are going to implement policies to get rid of the crisis, to deal with the crisis, and if they do successfully, they are going to leave behind all the Mexican states that cannot count with these capabilities. And it will be a terrible outcome if this happens. So that's why we need a federal government that can help to close these gaps. If we don't have that, we will see a divergence process between regions in Mexico, and it's not a good news.
Thank you very much. Interesting comments. We do have one comment in from Colombia, from our actually our CIPPEC representative in Colombia, affirming that there's a lot more, that they're seeing a lot more signs of cooperation, with local government, and better coordination, between the local level and national authorities on different policies. We have an observatory on private investment in some of the post-conflict zones in Colombia, and we've seen a more open door in some ways for coordinating policy in the post-conflict zones there. So it's very interesting to hear from you about areas where there might be more coordination you know, such as the example that was used about, you know, justice, finding solutions. I think, Edna, you talked about this, about finding solutions, you know, digitalized justice, if we will, you know, as a means of keeping that system going.
Yes.
Of course, the private sector has a very large capacity to be able to retool jobs, to think in terms of what maybe they hadn't considered been doing remotely, that they are now considering doing. Are you seeing signs that the private sector is retooling the way it works, or perhaps providing additional leadership, and not just leadership, but also capacity or opportunity to work differently in this environment? Does anybody have any comments on that?
If I may, so that's a very good comment, and let me give you my anecdotes about this. Is that, well, I was a public servant from 2014 to 2018, so I usually went to Congress, and you know, afterwards, when I came to Fedesarrollo in 2018, I usually don't go to this type of political control debates because it's just too costly. When you accept going to the Congress for a presentation, you actually have to be there for the whole day. You don't know where you're going to speak, and so on and so forth. So I typically refrain from doing so. Now, during this pandemic, I've actually talked to the Congress twice. I've also talked to the councils of Bogotá, Medellin, and that goes to the point that Jaime is doing, is that this actually is increasing the interaction that we have with local authorities, and that's good, because I mean, the physical presence sometimes is too costly, and this again is putting forward the evidence that you can actually interact in a virtual way, that you can actually have, you know, feedback from local authorities, from the private sector, from think tanks, and improve upon the policies you're implementing at the local level. So I think some of this, not all, but some of this will stick. I mean, I would imagine a world where in the near and medium term, some of these meetings are going to be done in a virtual way. People will recognize that the benefit of having all these meetings in a physical presence is actually too costly, and prevents some people from participating. So that goes to the question that Jaime is doing. Now, I mentioned a little bit during my presentation that one of the things that I think is going to change in a structural way is that there's going to be a break between the relationship between the government and the citizens. We economists typically think that the cost-benefit analysis implies that many activities can be virtualized at marginal cost with a lot of benefit. But typically lawyers are against that. Lawyers typically, have, say that you have to be physically present, you have to sign everything, a document, and so on and so forth. So these type of shocks, I think, they're not going to change the whole spectrum of the digital services provided by governments, but I think they're going to have an impact and a lasting impact in terms of the new services that can be provided by digital services. Now, the private sector, of course, plays a big role in this. I think that even the private sector was actually slow in adopting technologies, in adopting, for example, work-at-home practices. And now, again, they're seeing that sometimes work-at-home actually works and actually increases productivity, increases welfare for the workers. So again, I think that this crisis has taught us a few lessons about the benefits of virtualization. They're going to stay for the next probably years.
Does anybody else have any observations on this topic?
Yeah, I think that here in Argentina, I see the private sector very flexible and trying to adapt to this new environment. Tech companies are trying to come up with new solutions for firms, for the public sector, but I don't see the public sector with that flexibility. I see particularly the workers in the public sector like forcing a status quo in terms of regulations, you know, and all that. So I believe that maybe the private sector is going to move towards a more digital intensive environment, but I believe that the public sector is going to lag behind because of this resistance to change. You know, here in Argentina, the reform in the public sector in terms of digitalization, in terms of home remote work and all that has been really hard, and I don't see it changing now, really.
I just want to add that Mexican private sector are having a very, very important role in attending the health crisis. They are working hand in hand with hospitals, trying to provide them with the basics because they don't have the basics to attend the crisis. And I think they have very good initiatives trying to fill the gaps that the health system in Mexico has. And I'm not sure in the realm of their business, what are they thinking or doing to cope with the new circumstances, but at least we have seen them mobilize, trying to help the health services because they were in a very bad shape. So I think that they are taking leadership and they are doing a very good job. In some regions, I don't want to talk about all the country, but I think these initiatives have to be recognized. In an environment where private sector is being attacked and in a very hostile environment for entrepreneurs and private sector in the country in these days.
Thank you very much. We have one request for Ramiro for you to expand upon the concepts that you laid out of like digital natives and digital immigrants. How does that fit into this picture? Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about your thinking in that regard.
Yes, sure. What I was saying is that when we think about technological change and the fourth industrial revolution, we think a lot about the kids, children, and future workers, right? So we think about preschool, formal education, how we adapt the curricula, how we integrate AI into formal curricula, and so on. And we were always thinking about the future workers, you know, in the next 10 years, 15 years, whatever. And we didn't, I mean, I'm generalizing here, right? But we didn't focus on the people who are older, you know, who used to work in a different environment. So these are the digital immigrants, these, you know, like all the above 40 or 35, you know, who are trying to understand the technology, to understand digital devices and so on, who are in a way refusing to change, again, to adopt these new technologies. But when you see the age distribution of telework opportunities, you see there that the opportunities are in senior occupations, you know, are in people who have a lot of knowledge, human capital, social capital, not in the one who is just starting, you know, in a firm, but the one who is in the middle of the firm or maybe a boss or something like that. So if we need them, these people, to stay at home, we need to re-educate, we need to reskill them in order to make them work with these new devices or these digital media. So that's the idea. I mean, in a way, digital natives, they grew up with the technology. So for them, it's part of the things that are around them, but it's not the same for us. Mm-hmm. I mean, we used to play with discs, with cassettes, with whatever, with different technologies. And now we need to adapt very fast to these new technologies. That is not only about productivity. Now it's about that you need to stay at home in order to work from your house. So I believe that we need to refocus our effort, not only to work with kids, but also now to work with the older people, you know, with those that has, and again, 40, 45 and more, that they are the ones who can stay at home doing some remote work.
Very interesting. So we have an interesting question that very much fits within the kind of questions that we would ask at CIPPEC as well. What is the impact of the sort of social and economic crisis that you've been talking about on the quality of democracy in your countries? Do you think that this could actually improve democracy in your countries, this crisis, or is it debilitating the democratic process? What are your thoughts on the impact there?
In Mexico, the president wanted to change the budget law because he wants more power in this context, diminishing the role of the legislative in budget issues. And I really found it very dangerous because Mexican president has been concentrating power and diminishing the role of Congress in this very important issue, I think is very, very risky. Fortunately, we could stop this initiative. I don't know if it is going to be activated again in some weeks, but I think it's very risky because it is hitting and affecting the balance of power and checks and balances. And if things like this happen, I think democracy is going to suffer.
Well, if I can comment on that, that's a very interesting question and a very hard and deep question. So one of the, again, going back to the pessimism of Ramiro and my optimism, one of the good things is that President Duque is of course not a populist. He's from the right, but he's a very down-to-earth president that has been used a lot of scientific evidence to navigate through these very deep waters. But one of the things that we have learned is that we're in a good situation because President Duque again is not a populist. So even though he has a lot of power and the presidential figure in Colombia has a lot of power. He's not a populist, but if we were in hands of a populist, I would not be so happy, and probably democracy would be enriched, something like what Edna was mentioning for Mexico. And one of the things that has to be corrected, I think, is that to go through the different policy measures that Colombia has implemented during this crisis, the government has actually issued a lot of decrees that have the power of law. Through a specific figure, which is called an emergency situation, where the president in that situation can actually sign decrees that can change laws. Again, that's good because President Duque and the government is not the populist, but I wouldn't be so tranquil with that if we're in hands of a right or left populist. So I think we have to figure out some changes in the way that these procedures are implemented and having more check and balances, because again, the presidential figure in Colombia has a lot of power and that has to be carefully looked at. And the other thing is thinking about the future. Most of the solutions for the health crisis have a lot to do with better information from citizens to the government, from the way to properly target where infections are arising goes through, monitoring activities and probably cell phone activities from some persons. And that's fine, but there's a trade-off between these new powers that some governments are implementing in terms of localizing citizens around the country, and of course going to an equilibrium where we go to a big brother government which can actually monitor all private activities, and that risk is, I think, it's not small. So we do have to keep a balance between, of course, how to deal with the crisis and not go into big brother states that in the future, again, with less democratically inclined political leaders, could take advantage of that and erode democracies around the region.
Yeah, here in Argentina, I think that democracy is strong, but democratic institutions are a little weak. So we have this danger, right, of government in the need of implementing innovative policies outside the regulatory regime. And so we don't know if it's for the good of society or eventually it's going to be for the bad of society, as the case of these new technologies that Luis Fernando was saying. So I'm not sure. I think that now I'm going to be a little optimistic. I believe that in Argentina, the society, in a way, is asking new things, asking the governments to behave differently. So I believe in this power. Maybe it's just, I need some optimism in something, but I think that society is asking the government to behave in a more democratic way. So I think that eventually this will enter into the institutions and maybe will be a new system of check and balances. So I bet on that. I mean, maybe just my little tiny optimistic heart, but I don't know.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time here. I do have two other questions I wanted to pose. We have several questions related to the issue of inclusivity. And I'm wondering if you have any comments about balancing sort of inclusiveness into the economic agenda, the policy agenda, if you will. How do you balance between the opportunities for larger companies versus like smaller initiatives, small entrepreneurs? How do you balance that out in this crisis?
Well, one of the things that's important on that question is that Latin America, again, as a region, has very low savings rates, and that implies financial deepening is not high, except Chile, which has the largest financial deepening in the region, and also that we have very weak capital markets. So small entrepreneurs that are actually aiming for starting up a business don't actually have much finance opportunities. So again, thinking about these structural reforms, one of those has to be focused on how to increase saving rates, how to develop financial markets, but especially on how to develop capital markets, which are actually lacking in the region. And of course, the role of the government is important, but the government cannot substitute for a good and well-functioning capital market. So I think, again, in this window of opportunity, one of the key issues to be dealt with is actually how to, again, develop more deep financial and capital markets to actually have more inclusive growth.
Yeah, sorry, I believe in Argentina is, of course, tougher because of the crisis, right? So I agree with you, Luis Fernando, about our lack of savings and a proper financial market. So I believe that in this situation, I believe that big firms are going to navigate this transition better than entrepreneurs and small firms. I think that we need both, but I'm not sure how can these small firms cope with this risk, right? In this environment without credit, without proper financial markets.
I agree with my colleagues. And I think that if there is not a public response, a governmental response, we are going to have a lot of small business having a very, very bad time. And as I said at the beginning, in Mexico, small business creates 7 out of 10 jobs. So the impact to Mexican economy and for Mexicans are going to be really hard. And you know, this is an opportunity, as my colleagues have said, to rethink of how to bring to formality to informal small enterprises and informal workers. And I hope this could be used as a platform to think out of the box, to use fiscal stimulus, if they exist, to create schemes to bring to formality all the informal sector and to give opportunities to growth. It demands a lot from the state. It demands structural reforms, as Luis Fernando said, but you know, we have the opportunity to do these things now. I hope we take advantage of the circumstances.
I certainly do as well. I wish we had time for more questions. We do have more of them coming in, but before we end, I did want to ask you about you as leaders of some of the most important think tanks in Latin America. How do you see the opportunities for you to be able to contribute to this debate? I mean, this forum, obviously, we had hoped could contribute to that, but do you see big opportunities for you to get your voices across and your policy recommendations? Is it more complicated, or are there more opportunities for you to share ideas for leading us in these new directions?
With the federal government in Mexico is very difficult because as the government is very, very hostile to private sector, it is also with think tanks and civil society in general. But we are finding very good opportunities to have conversation, substantive conversation with local governments, with other actors that want to take part of policy solutions, and I think it's an opportunity to get closer to the ones that really wants to make a difference in this context. So we're still working. We will work a lot to have conversation with federal government. I am not sure we are going to be successful, but with other powers, the judicial powers, we have a very, very, very good conversation with them, talking about digital justice. So the president, the president's staff, they are not the only ones that take decisions in this country, and I hope that we can take advantage of the access we have with another decision makers to provide analysis and evidence that can inform decisions and public policy.
So if I may, just a small comment on that. Well, for us in Fedesarrollo, actually, I'm not only educating my daughters and doing home chores, but also increasing a lot my working hours, which is fortunate because this crisis, of course, has a lot of negative impact. But in terms of the demands from both the government, the private sector, and the press, Fedesarrollo has always had this ample space for communicating policies and our projections, our research, our reforms. And I mean, we have to take advantage of that opportunity. Even in the case of Mexico, as Edna was mentioning, I mean, producing research and having this type of agendas and discussions are actually good, even though the general government might not implement some of them. Again, there's some political space for local governments that might be useful. So, I mean, for us has been a blessing. Of course, we don't want this crisis, but on the other hand, we're working a lot and we're implementing and having a lot of discussions on the policy side.
Yeah, same here. I think that this is our moment in a way. I think that there's no time to play politics or game. I mean, now they need data. They need good analysis. And I believe that this is our moment, you know, to go with the data, with our analysis, with the papers that we have. And I think that this is a very exciting moment also for us.
I agree.
Very good. Well, my apologies to our participants. There are a few other really interesting questions that I would love to spend time, talking about. I would welcome your suggestions from any of our participants or any of our audience on future events that we could help sponsor. Please send us your suggestions for how we might develop, further conversations on this topic. I want to thank all of our participants, Luis Fernando, Ramiro, Edna, for your contributions. Julia Pomares sent me her apologies. She had some connectivity problems and was not able to reconnect to the event, but hopefully we will be able to do future events on this topic. So thanks again to everyone. This has been a really, really interesting session. It has been recorded, so will be available on our website for other people who were not able to tune in to be able to hear as well. Thanks again to all of our participants, and we look forward to further conversations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.